Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Raina Peter, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group at the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access past videos by visiting our YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to you if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system at any time during the program or have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able to and ask just one brief question. If you're a part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming the Director of the Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Raina, for that warm and wonderful welcome. And thank you all for joining us on this Thursday morning. It's a new time for us, and I think it was a success. It's great to see so many of you joining us this morning for what is going to be a really wonderful program, Whirlwind, What to Expect for Digital Democracy in 2024 with our visiting fellow, Katie Harbath. We're presenting this in partnership with our friends at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I want to be sure to thank AT&T for their support of this program. Before we get started and I take things over to Katie, I want to make sure that I invite you back to the Dole Institute. Next Tuesday, we'll have a representative from the U.S. State Department, Ryan Gerlinger, who's a Ukraine policy chief, and will be giving us an update on Ukraine policy in the United States. That will be a presentation and a question and answer afterwards. That'll be on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Here at the Institute, another unusual time, but we're kind of mixing things up a little bit, and it's going really well, I think. And then don't forget to join us at the end of the month on November 30th when we honor Katie Sowers with the Elizabeth Dole Women in Leadership Lecture. Now that I've got the business out of the way, I'm going to introduce our wonderful visiting fellow, Katie. She formerly served as Facebook's public policy director, where she spent 10 years building and leading teams that managed elections and worked with governments and political figures to connect them to their constituents via social media. She's now CEO of Anchor Change, where she helps clients think through technology policy issues, and she's a senior advisor at the International Republican Institute, as well as a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you all so much for joining us. Katie, please come up and
Thank you.
And tell us what we're in for.
Tell us what we're in for. Oh, I got to laugh. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much for having me here. It's been such a delight to have the opportunity, especially yesterday. The team was so gracious to walk us through the museum. And there's a lot of things about Senator Dole's legacy, particularly around tech, that I had forgotten. I knew that his 1996 campaign was one of the first to have a website at that point in time, but I had forgotten about the senator's role in bringing television cameras to the Senate and working with C-SPAN on that, as well as the Bayh-Dole Act that helped to transfer patents from the federal government, where federal funds were being used, to the private sector, which helped to create companies like Google and others that I in all honesty, was not aware of and had forgotten. And so it's been a real delight to kind of continue to dig into that and learn a lot more about the senator and his role in this topic that we're going to be talking about today. So as Aubrey mentioned, I have spent my last 20 years of my career working at this intersection of technology and politics. And things have changed a lot, and they're continuing to change a lot. And so today what I want to walk you through is where I see the current state of play at the intersection of technology and politics, and where I see things going over the next year and even beyond. A little bit more about myself. Before Facebook, I was a Republican digital strategist. I started my career at the Republican National Committee during President Bush's re-election campaign. I started in August of 2003. I oftentimes tell students I spent 10 years at a role at Facebook at a company that didn't exist when I graduated UW-Madison in 2003. And so I could have never dreamt of this career that I was going to have, because these jobs and these problems just did not exist at the time that I was going to school. And then in addition to working with a lot of nonprofit groups, I also work directly with online platforms on a lot of these issues, as well as write a newsletter and a podcast like so many other people on these topics. So I want to start with the global picture. Next year is an unprecedented year of elections for the world. It's the first time ever in the same year as a US presidential election that you will have elections in India, Indonesia, maybe Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the European Parliament. That is a huge, large part of the population. In total, and in fact, I need to update this number, I am now tracking 83 national level elections across 78 countries next year. By my math, that means 3.9 billion people will be affected by elections next year. So it's not necessarily how many are going to the polls, but it's the total population of those countries. So this is just a huge geopolitical moment. Many of these countries are part of the G7, the G20, BRICS, other very important international organizations. But this is also a lot of fronts for the technology companies to have to try to protect the integrity of elections and to be looking at that. And we're doing that and going into the current state of play with a very changed technological field. So I break this up into 3 buckets right now. We have your legacy technology companies. These are the ones that have been around 10, 15, 20 years. Your Facebooks, now called Meta, your Googles, your Microsofts. These companies have been changing a lot. A lot of them have gone through a lot of layoffs in the last year. And so they're doing a lot of restructuring within their companies. A lot of them, with the rise of, many of them have been working on artificial intelligence for quite some time. But with last November's release of ChatGPT by a company called OpenAI, it really exploded on the public stage, because now it was much more easy for the public and other people in which to use these tools. So these companies found themselves scrambling to start to build AI into their products, which brought, in my world, a lot of questions. Okay, well, how is politics going to work as part of this? What are your rules around politicians and other things going to be? A lot of them are changing up their approach to election integrity matters. They've changed their approach to mis and disinformation policies, particularly around the 2020 election. We haven't heard much yet what they're going to do around 2024, although yesterday a few of them announced some initiatives around requiring political ads using artificial intelligence to have to be labeled. But we just don't know. And you'll hear as I continue to go through this, there's a lot of other factors that they're having to deal with. I put X, formerly Twitter, just in its own bucket. I don't even know how to categorize it. But if any of you are following this, Elon Musk is just unpredictable. He says one thing, he does another. He changes his mind overnight. He makes decisions. He's severely cut the teams that do trust and safety at the company. And it's very unclear to know what impact Twitter is going to have on these upcoming elections. Twitter was never a place that many rank and file voters were going, right? It was really a community of journalists, politicians, political figures, other influencers, academics, that came together and what was said there could very much then get into the traditional media ecosystem in other places. But there's a community there that dissipated when Musk took over, and many of them in trying to find a new home of where that might be. Which leads me to my third bucket, which is there's a lot of newer tech platforms that are on the stage now, that this is going to be the first election cycle where they're in the spotlight, where they're having to deal with this. So they're writing these policies for the first time. They haven't had the years to build up the tools that Facebook and others kind of started building even before 2016, but a lot after 2016. These include TikTok, which is the video app. Many of you have probably heard of that one. Substack is a place for people to write newsletters. It's kind of a version of a blog, but instead it goes into your inbox. This is how I write my newsletter. Nextdoor is an app that's very much meant for your local neighborhoods, for people to be able to connect. Blue Sky was kind of a Twitter replacement, or version of, it works very much like Twitter. Discord is a place where people really use to organize, and they create something called channels or groups that people can engage with. And Twitch is actually for gamers. People, I know it might seem a little weird, I know my nephews love to do this. They go on and they watch people play games, which I was kind of like, why would you do that? But then I remember somebody was like, Katie, we did that when we grew up and we go to somebody's house when we're playing Mario Brothers on old school Nintendo and you're watching them. But now you get to watch with everybody, and there's chat rooms and there's other ways that people are engaging. And politics works its way into everything. And all of these platforms are taking slightly different approaches to politics and news on their platforms. And so rather than just having a couple of main platforms that people are using, you're seeing it becoming very decentralized. In addition to all of this, we have US politics. I'm not going to go into everything on where we are in the US politics right now, but on the tech end, what a lot of people are paying attention to is the inquiries that Representative Jim Jordan has been doing around the engagement between the government, the social media platforms, and academic researchers. After 2016, there was a lot of criticism that these entities had not worked closely enough together to be able to find and detect the Russian interference that happened in the 2016 election. And so after that, we all worked to try to find ways to better share intelligence, to understand the information ecosystem and what was happening. And so these partnerships got formed, and they were done ahead of the 2022 cycle, or the 2020 cycle and the 2022 cycle. Now, there's legitimate questions about the role that the government should play, particularly when it comes to domestic speech, and what they should be doing in terms of how much should they be pressuring the companies and what decisions they make. And Jim Jordan has been really investigating that. And I think that's a fair thing. But he's been going about it in a way that has been it's really scared a lot of trust and safety people and researchers because they feel harassed. They're being buried under legal fees. And it's having a chilling effect on their work to be able to do this. At the same time, you have the campaigns who are continuing to use various digital strategies for part of their campaigns, and we'll continue to dig into this. But a couple of trends that I've seen is, one, they're moving away from social media platforms for advertising to streaming platforms. We're going to go into that a little bit later. They're already using AI. We've had some, the RNC, Ron DeSantis' PAC, and others have used AI in ads, and we suspect we'll see more. Campaigns and other vendors are starting to build tools so that I was talking with the archivist and others here. There's so many amazing papers and stuff downstairs, right, from Senator Dole. You could get that all digitized and create your own what's called a large language model that you could search across all of that content. Or you could be like, write me an email because you have everything that the senator ever said. Write me an email or this type of thing in the tone of the senator's voice and the ways that he might talk. Those are the types of ways, if I was a campaign, I would create that to help me to create some of that content. We also see campaigns continue to use text messaging. And I just mentioned that, and throughout this presentation, one of the things I've been trying to do is, when I was at Facebook in 2016, there were a lot of things we missed. And a lot of what I'm trying to do as we go into this next election is like, what are the rocks I'm not looking under? What are the things we're not talking about that could end up being ways that actually impact this election? And texting could be one of them. We also have the courts. So the Supreme Court is hearing 3 cases regarding tech this term. All of them have to do with with the First Amendment. The first was last week they heard arguments about whether or not government officials can block people from engaging with them on their social media platforms. The second one is whether or not state governments like Texas and Florida can dictate to a company like Facebook how they moderate content and what they leave up or take down. And the third goes back to what the Jim Jordan inquiry, which is what is the appropriate role of government in working with social media companies and pressuring them on their content moderation policies. You may have heard that case called Missouri v. Biden. When the court took it up, it's now been renamed Murphy v. Missouri. Now, we haven't had yet the arguments for the last two cases. The amicus briefs are due for the Texas and Florida cases. One's here at the beginning of December, one's in January. We don't know for the other, which means that it's highly likely that these decisions are going to come down sometime next year, June at the latest. That's in the middle of our election. And so this too is having a chilling effect for the companies, for researchers and others, because they don't know if what they might be setting up, the court's going to determine to be illegal. And they don't want to necessarily run, obviously, afoul of the law and what that looks like. And so all eyes are very much on this. And then on top of that, you just have the geopolitics of all of this. Last week, we had the executive order from Biden on artificial intelligence. You had the UK summit that happened. The G7 has put out their own things on AI alone. A lot of conversation about TikTok and whether or not to ban TikTok and what that looks like. You see in other countries, so in Canada, for instance, they passed a law wanting to get the tech companies to pay media organizations for their content. Meta responded by saying, fine, we're going to pull news. Well, that law now doesn't officially go into effect until December 19th, and a bunch of smaller news organizations are now trying to get Trudeau, the prime minister there, to change the legislation because they're already seeing such adverse effects of this because they don't have the resources of the legacy companies to make up the marketing and everything from that. And so I find it kind of interesting of sort of the impact of what is happening between the big tech players and other big players in media and other places, and how the smaller platforms, smaller news organizations and others are being impacted. On top of all this, you have civil society, who's very frustrated at the reductions that these tech companies have made. They're very concerned about some of the changes these companies have made on their election integrity work. I mentioned the academic institutions and the researchers who are very much spending their time responding to Freedom of Information Act requests. And this isn't just a few, they're getting flooded with them. They're kind of being spammed by them. And so they're having to spend their time answering those and answering the legal questions and dealing with that rather than doing their actual research. And then the traditional media continues to struggle. They aren't sure how to cover somebody like former President Trump. CNN was criticized for the town hall earlier this year that they did. There was the interview he did with Meet the Press. They continue to see layoffs, and they continue to struggle as well. And again, it's not just here in the United States, it's around the world. So in India, the prime minister there, Narendra Modi, is up for his third term for this next election. There are concerns about his suppression of journalists and journalism. He's tried to kind of take over some more of the Electoral Commission, lots of threats of violence. I also have been watching, so there's many parties in India. So I always say the US elections are the exception of how they're run versus the rest of the world in pretty much every single way. So there's a lot of parties in India, but the main opposition to Narendra Modi's party is the Congress Party. And Narendra Modi's party is called the BJP for short. And they, about a month and a half ago, decided that they aren't going to appear in certain news programs because they perceive those news anchors to be in favor of Modi. And so they're boycotting them. In Indonesia, they have the potential of having 3 elections this year, but their first one will be on Valentine's Day. They have a fake news law that many are concerned about that might cause them to ask companies to take down more content than the companies feel comfortable with. They're worried that they're going to ask for opposition content to be taken down. In fact, in India, there was a story I saw today too. Sorry, I'm jumping between countries. But in India, they're now asking more companies that they have 24 hours to take down deep fake videos. and other things of that nature. And again, they're trying to, sometimes the things they're asking to be taken down don't feel right to be taken down. In Taiwan, it's all China and the Chinese influence. It boggles my mind. We talk a lot about US-China relations, but because of what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Israel, I worry that we've taken our eye off the ball a bit of Taiwan. There are elections on January 14th. It's not that far away. And we could end up finding ourselves with having conflicts in 3 really hot spots all around the world. Mexico, part of the reason this year is so special next year is because Mexico's on a 6-year cycle for their election. Their president, whose nickname is AMLO, cannot run again. But Mexico also has a lot of concerns of treatment of journalists, violence against journalists. The current president tried to gut the Electoral Commission. Their court stopped that. But there is a lot of concern about what that environment will look like in Mexico. Their election should be in June or July of next year. Then you go to the United Kingdom. So a lot of you have probably heard there's not been much regulation on tech here in the States, right? At least not at the federal level. But that's not true for elsewhere around the world. In the United Kingdom, they recently passed the online safety bill, and that enforcement's going to be starting to go into effect next year. UK will likely have their election toward the end of 2024. And then in the European Union, there's 2 pieces of legislation, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. The Digital Services Act deals more with the type of content that I do, and the tech stuff and content moderation. That too is starting to be enforced for the first time. So I like to joke that I think both the UK and EU are sort of the dogs that caught the regulatory car, because they aren't quite sure now. They're going to have to realize how hard some of these decisions are that the companies have to make, how hard it is to do in a very quick fashion. One of the things we did with the students yesterday is I made them be a content moderator. We showed examples, and they had to decide whether or not they thought it violated or not. And I kind of made them be in the shoes of a tech exec, and these regulators are going to find themselves in the same spot. Now, coming back home, excuse me. Coming back home, according to Ad Impact, they expect that $10 billion is going to be spent on this race, or on this election, sorry, in the US. Now, the interesting thing here, though, that's a little different, is that it's not the presidential election that's going to be the top spender, it's on down ballot races. And we saw this on Tuesday, right? And we saw this in elections in Wisconsin earlier this year, especially with the Dobbs decision. And so they are predicting that a lot of this spend is going to be pushed more local. Now, the other thing, though, that I found weird about this graph is that broadcast is getting 50% of that spend. But when you look at where people are spending their time, only 20% of people are watching broadcast TV. This summer was the first time ever that linear TV, so broadcast or cable, went below 50% of people. More people are moving to streaming. Some of you may have shifted from cable TV to like a YouTube TV or something like that. Your TVs, if they connect to the internet, are what are considered connected TVs or smart TVs. And so that means that the amount of targeting that campaigns can do on a place like Facebook, they can also do to you right off your television that you're watching. And so there's a disconnect here about where the campaign money is predicted to be spent versus, and a lot of this is based upon where it's been spent already, versus where people are spending their time. And I was telling the students a story last night that I had the opportunity once to talk to a candidate about why I was really torn if I was going to vote for him or his opponent, and I ended up voting for his opponent. And he was like, we were talking about why. And he's like, didn't you see any of my commercials? And I was like, no, I don't remember seeing them. And then he was like, oh, wait, did you cut the cord? And I was like, yeah. And he goes, oh, I did mostly broadcast. I mean, there was some digital, but mostly broadcast. And I was like, I'm the rare swing voter, single woman, Northern Virginia person that you want to have. And so, if we have some surprise results, this is probably going to be one of the first places I'm going to go look to see about where they were spending their ad money. The other rock that I'm looking under is podcasting. So podcasting has grown in popularity. We are seeing a lot of the Republican candidates go on podcasts, not just ones about news and politics, but on ones that have tech people, other audiences to try to reach them. I know RFK Jr. has been doing the same. But the stats that I want to point out, and it might be kind of hard to read, but the 94% number is an important one. So this graph is from a SiriusXM podcast trends report. And what that 94% represents is that 94% of people who listen to news and political podcasts do not view cable and broadcast TV as authentic or trustworthy. According to Pew Internet, 85% of people who listen to podcasts trust what they hear on podcasts. Now, I'm not sitting here saying every podcaster is lying. I mean, I'm a podcaster, but there are ones where, again, they're not necessarily all traditional journalists. They don't necessarily have that journalist background of what they are saying and everything. And so, again, if there's a surprise result, one thing I'm going to look is what were they doing on podcasts? And then you add into that what are called influencers. So influencers are folks that are on social media. I suppose I could call myself an attempted influencer with my newsletter and other things like that. But Gen Z, according to this poll that the Associated Press did, prefers to pay independent creators like me versus print or digital newspapers. They are also turning to TikTok and Instagram for breaking news versus other places. Now, and a lot of this too, again, it's not traditional media that they're necessarily watching. It's what are called news influencers. And they're oftentimes taking traditional media reports and others and then adding their own spin to it. Now, again, I'm not saying that all these influencers are telling lies. They aren't necessarily. But one of the things we've seen with the Israeli conflict is that when things start happening rapidly, it's very hard, not just for those on social media, but traditional media, to necessarily be able to sift out what is true or not as part of all of this. And so you just see a very big difference generationally of where people are going for this information, which is a challenge for candidates, for those who are trying to monitor the information environment, et cetera. As I mentioned, it's getting very decentralized. So it's a lot of different places to try to track all of this. And again, remember, it's not just on the US, it's on a global scale. So looking ahead, if I've made you all sufficiently anxious, I'm gonna make you even more anxious and then try to end on a positive note before we take questions. So first and foremost, artificial intelligence is going to be the big buzzword of, I think, this campaign. But I have a mantra that I would encourage all of you to pick up, not just on the AI stuff, but everything, which is to panic responsibly. I've bought the URL, a merch store is coming your way, we've got stickers, everything, to be a reminder to us, because I understand why the media has to report on this, but if you were to watch the news, you would think, there are folks who are saying this is gonna be the last human election, AI is gonna destroy the world. There are folks who are like, AI is going to is gonna save the world. Let's be honest, the truth is in the middle, right? There's a lot of things I'm really excited about the future of AI and what it can bring. And I frankly am really glad we're having these conversations now about the types of guardrails and other things we might need to have on it, because we did not have those conversations about social media back in the early aughts when all of that was first being built. And so it's a good thing that we're at least starting early. It is a challenge, it is a hard problem, and you're not gonna be able to stop progress in the innovation. And so it's definitely gonna be a challenge, and we're definitely going to see folks trying to use this to create fake material. There's a lot of concerns on that we have to think about. But I'm kind of putting this, at least at the moment, of kind of circa 2008. It was Obama's first election. He used Facebook a lot, but it really wasn't until 2012 when his data operation was even more advanced, more using these tools. And so let's have this conversation again for the midterms in 26 and then the presidential in 28. And I bet AI is going to be play even more of a role there. Political ads. I think there's a lot still, everyone's trying to figure out on political ads. There's the use of AI in political ads, and there's a lot of questions about what the online platforms are going to do. But I also keep trying to remind people, we still don't know how broadcast and cable are going to handle AI in political ads. And remember, I showed you they're predicting most of that spend on broadcast and cable. Because using AI isn't just going to, because just because it's a tech tool doesn't mean it only exists online. Some of these online platforms have decided to try to ban political ads. We don't have time for me to tell you the long drawn-out story of how hard it is to define what is political or what is an issue ad, but that is a challenge. And then also just having transparency into what ads, campaigns, and others are running on these platforms. Facebook and Google have built these ad transparency libraries. I was a big part of building the Facebook one, but other platforms and streaming services don't have that yet. Big question about to TikTok or not TikTok. So on the Democratic side, the Biden White House, it was reported a week or two ago in the Post, Washington Post, that they have 20 people at the White House to just deal with influencers, to try to engage them, to get them to be getting out the administration's message, to understand what's happening. The campaign has said that their big strategy, too, is going to be really trying to push out counter-messaging. Counter-messaging to the mis and disinformation they expect to see on these platforms. But they want to be on these platforms because they want to be able to reach young voters. Now, if you watched the debate last night, TikTok was a big part of the Republican debate last night, with most of the candidates other than Vivek saying they were going to ban TikTok right away. And I think that you're going to see campaigns, not just at the presidential level, but down ballot on the Republican side being like, we can't be on the platform, but we also maybe don't want to ignore the voters that are there. They're going to try to use influencers, I think, in which to do that. And one of the challenges we're going to have is, are they paid? Are they not paid? It is hard to require disclosure of that, or forced disclosure of that, and I think that's going to unfortunately add to sort of this overall distrust and or lack of clarity that people have about their information environment and the motivations of the ones that they're getting their news from. Text messaging and spam text. I don't know if any of you get text messages from a politician and you're like, how in the world did you get my phone number? Right? There isn't a ton of regulation around these text messages. With email and other places not being as fruitful now for small dollar donations, we might unfortunately see an increase in those text messages. But again, those rocks I'm looking under, text messaging is one of them. And then lastly, what do the tech companies do? How did the layoffs actually affect this work that they're doing? How vocal are they? What countries do they choose to prioritize over others? The hard part about a lot of this work is we aren't necessarily going to know. I get the question a lot, are they doing enough? Are they ready? The hard thing is we don't know, and we're not going to know. We can learn from past elections. We know some things that work that we can implement, but you have to make sure you're not fighting the last war. Because the actors who want to try to manipulate it are getting smarter. Tools like AI were not around when we originally did that. There's never a finish line in this work. It's always sort of a cat and mouse game as we do this. And like I said, a lot of the companies are taking different approaches to this that I'm watching because I'm not quite sure how all of that is going to shake out. Another metaphor I very much have been using for next year is a kaleidoscope. Because I'm like, a spectrum's too simple. And a kaleidoscope has so many other bits and pieces, and depending how you turn that wheel, you get a different picture, which makes it so hard to predict about where we'll be this time next year, because it all depends how these different things keep playing off of one another. So what does this mean? One, expect a lot of rapid change. We need to be flexible. We need to find ways that we can pivot quickly. I think what we saw in October with the speaker's race and the Israeli conflict is only a taste of how quickly different things could change all around the world for us. I don't think we're going to get congressional regulation before the election. I do think it's more likely in 2025, 2026, in the next Congress. But keep an eye on state legislation. There's a lot happening in the states of trying to regulate tech companies. I suspect that congressional hearings will continue. And a lot of questions on how governments and others are working with social media companies. I think we will continue to try to obviously do research and other things on disinformation and fighting disinformation. But because of the First Amendment, I think it's going to be very hard for the United States to do any regulation that's content-based. Meaning, if this post says this, you have to leave it up or take it down. Instead, I suspect we will start to see legislation and conversation move to making the companies provide more transparency into their decision-making and how they work, as well as oversight. Because nobody wants the tech companies in charge. Nobody wants the government to be solely in charge. Nobody wants any one entity to be solely in charge. And so I think we're in the process of building a new set of checks and balances to try to hold each other accountable for work in this space. We talked about the courts, and I think those decisions are going to have huge ramifications on the election and also potentially spur regulation in the next Congress, because there's the chance we're going to get conflicting court rulings plus all these state laws, and I think Congress might have to do something. And this is on top of all the Trump cases happening. And how does what he's doing in Congress, or not in Congress, what is he, and what's happening with him in his court cases, and how does that play out in the election? Campaigns are going to be thinking through multiple plans. Which of these platforms do we need to be on? Where is our audience? How do we try to find new people? Where are the swing voters? How do we get around the sort of political complications and national security concerns of a TikTok, but knowing that that's where people are at? And then finally, if you haven't been playing around with some of these AI tools like ChatGPT, Bard is Google's tool, Bing is Microsoft's tool, play around with them a bit. Start familiarizing yourself with a lot of these tools. I find it's helpful to understand how they work. To give you a couple of examples, I've used them to help write recommendation letters. So I'm like, please write me a recommendation letter. Here's the person's name. Here's where we work together. Here's a few attributes I'd like for it to say. It pumps out a first draft within 20 seconds that I can then edit. I've used it to help write strategic plans where I put all the details of what I want to do and it formats it for me. I'm very excited for the day. I mean, these tools exist, but they're still a little clunky, where I can have an outline or a document, and I can just be like, please make this into a PowerPoint, and do that for me. So there's a lot of those things that I think are going to be really helpful for people as part of all of this as we continue to move forward. So I would love to take questions. Like I mentioned, I do write a newsletter on this and do a podcast. It's at anchorchange.substack.com. If you want to stay up to date on these topics as we go into the next year, I'd be happy to do so. But I really appreciate all of your attention, and we'll take questions, and we've got a microphone, so if you don't mind waiting to ask your question until the microphone comes to you. So our online audience, oh, thank you for the water. I was going to ask for that. But yeah, and ask me anything. I am really open to anything you might want to hear about.
First of all, I'd like to make a, is this working? First of all, I'd like to make a comment about states. My home state is South Dakota, and the governor there will not allow any of the employees to have access to TikTok.
Yep.
But my question is this. On Sunday, I had a conversation with a young man about 22 years old. And we started talking about the upcoming election. He says, well, I don't like Biden, so I wouldn't vote for him. So I said, well, would you vote for Trump? No, he's the worst president we ever had. I said, well, who do you see that you would vote for of all the people? He said, none of them, because they don't really care about us people anymore. So how do the candidates intend to get to those people to get them to vote?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? But I think, so there's one thing I've been thinking a lot about that I didn't mention as part of this. I am really nervous with the fact that a lot of people are burnt out on the news, right? It's been a tough couple more than a couple years. People are burnt out on the news. They're not excited about either the presidential candidates. And so are we looking at a low turnout election next year? Maybe. But then I throw in the down ballot stuff and what happened on Tuesday and what's happened in Wisconsin. And I'm starting to see more chatter that it's going to be the reverse coattails, where a Biden or Trump, depending upon who wins, is actually pulled up by the down ballot races and people going to the polls to vote for them, which is a possibility, or they might go to the ballot box and vote for the down ballot and maybe not vote for president. I don't know. I also still think there's a chance. It's a small chance, but there's still a chance that Trump nor Biden might be our nominees. I still remember in 2007, I know it's a different world now, but in 2007, I worked on the Giuliani campaign. We all thought it was going to be Giuliani Clinton at the beginning of that one. We did not think it was going to be Obama McCain when that happened. There's a lot still that can happen. And so I just leaving all my options open because I have been burned so many times and being like, there's no way that's going to happen. And then you're not ready for it because you're like, there's no way it can happen. So I don't know how Trump, that's going to be a big challenge for both of if they are the nominees. That is going to be a huge hurdle that they're going to have to overcome.
My comment has to do with those of us in the room who are tech challenged. I consider myself fairly good at a lot of pieces of technology, but I've never been on TikTok. I can't make heads or tails of Instagram. I've stopped looking at Facebook regularly, except for my grandchildren's posts. What should we old folks, non-tech people, be doing in this arena?
I think, so you don't necessarily have to be on social media or those. I mean, if you're wanting to know how those work and the types of content that might be there, I find I do best by actually being on it and learning. You don't have to. I think there's a lot of folks, not to plug my own newsletter again, but like if you want me to help you to understand what's happening, like feel free to sign up on that. But a lot of this, like I'm not saying that traditional media doesn't have a role and an impact, right? And there's still, with that Canada news law I mentioned, the smaller platforms are worried because a lot of them hadn't built up their own websites and stuff. But some of the legacy news organizations, so your CBCs and others, say that they actually saw an increase of people going back to their websites and their apps after Facebook pulled a lot of those news links. And so I think that the biggest thing is not necessarily, oh my gosh, do I need to be on this app or that app or something like that. It's all of us being, very just conscious of our news intake and conscious of where we're getting our news. If we hear something that we're not quite sure about, or it might make the hair on your neck stand up, I say this to a lot of folks. If that happens, maybe do a little bit of research before you share it to make sure that you've got all the facts of what you might be being told or not. And I think that's something that all of us of all age ranges kind of need to do because, I don't know if any of you remember, I think it was earlier this year, there's that picture of the Pope in that white jacket that ended up, okay, I'm getting very blank stares, but there's this picture of the Pope in a very stylish white jacket. I won't lie, I thought it was real. I was like, oh, look at the Vatican, okay. Then I found it was AI generated. I had been duped by it. And so I think it can happen to the best of us when that's happening. So it's just sort of that and just kind of doing an audit of our overall information ecosystem and where we're getting our news and kind of thinking about that. But that would be my best advice.
You talked about some of the benefits of AI and how you used it, but my biggest fear is some of the false things where it says somebody's video that somebody said this. How does the average person sort through that? You kind of touched on it, but I am lost as to how to know what is real and what is not real nowadays. Truth or not truth.
Yeah, and that's a really good extension of the answer I was giving before. So right now there's a lot of discussion amongst the tech companies and the governments about should this stuff be labeled, can you watermark it, how to think about being able to provide people when they see that so that you know whether what was generated via AI or not. I think that, you know, I'm less worried about it at the presidential level and the national level, because I think that there will be plenty of news organizations and fact checks and all that, that if something comes out about one of the presidential candidates, that will be tracked down pretty quickly by some of the news organizations. I'm more worried about at the local level, if those things can be chased down as quickly, especially with less local media. I'm also more worried about audio deepfakes than I am video, because you have less contextual clues when you're watching that. And so, again, if you're not sure, doing some additional research of trying to find news articles that might be mentioning what they said or other things to try to verify the content that you're seeing is true or not as part of that. It is putting a lot more burden on you all while everyone else, while the companies and others try to figure out how to label some of this. And that's also a big debate on the question too of these policies of how do you determine if it's true or false? What types of AI are okay or not? So to give you an example, one campaign vendor that I was reading was like, what if I just want to use AI to generate, I want a farmer in a field with a particular barn behind them. Can I just use AI to generate that instead of having to go find a crew and that farmer and that barn to do that? That seems okay. But then you have Ron DeSantis's PAC creating an AI version of Trump's voice, reading something that Trump wrote on Truth Social. Is that okay? Trump wrote it, but he didn't say it. So there's all these ethical questions we're trying to work through right now as well as part of this, which is going to be a challenge for people and is going to be a challenge in this information environment while we try to build up the tools and the ethical guardrails of how we should handle it. Sorry, I don't have a very uplifting answer, but.
Just about transparency, can you speak a little bit about your views and what we can hope for to see some of the dark money flows that are behind some of these things? Do you see anything, any hope there?
Well, at least not in the US on the regulatory side. But that being said, at Facebook, when we built the political ad transparency tools, one of the things, so we were building these in mind of, we missed the Russian Internet Research Agency running ads on our platform. So we needed to fix that problem. Now to do so, the Russian Internet Research Agency wasn't being open, being like, hi, we're Russians, we're running ads, right? They were lying about who they were. Our other challenge was most of their content was not specific about Clinton or Trump, but it was about issues like Black Lives Matter and immigration. So we had to turn on its head the traditional way of thinking about transparency and campaign finance, which starts with the entity, meaning you are a candidate, you're a political party, you're this type of organization, thus your ads must have these disclaimers, right, and this transparency. We had to flip it on its head and start with the piece of content. If your content has political or issue-based, then you must have a disclaimer and go into this transparency database. Well, let me tell you, that ended up catching a whole bunch of organizations who are like, we're not political. Why are you making us do a disclaimer? We don't want to do that. We don't want that to be public. And one of the benefits, though, of doing that, to your point about the dark money, is that people started realizing, wait, there's all these different organizations and LLCs who own LLCs. Who are these folks? And journalists were able to dig into that a bit more. And so my hope is that by trying to also get more of these online ad transparency tools and others, for researchers to be able to look into this might help shine more light on where some of that money might be coming from around all this. We'll see if that becomes true or not, but that is one of the things we saw a little bit with the Facebook tool.
Hi, I want to thank you. This has been very illuminating. I want to go back to the fact-checking. Which sites do you think are the best? You know, the factcheck.org, Snopes, PolitiFact, would you recommend for people to use to do fact-checking?
So first I would go to, so Pointer has an international fact-checking consortium. So I would start there and any of those fact checkers there. And it's not just ones in the US, there's international ones as well. That would be where I would first start of looking at, because they have a process that they make those fact checkers go through to be certified. And then most companies, so this is sometimes a misperception, like the Facebooks and TikToks of the world, they don't have fact checkers inside the organizations. They're working with those Pointer certified ones of doing that. So I don't remember the website off the top of my head, but that's what Google's for.
I have a bit of a feel of how clinical decision support and AI tools are used in healthcare, but I have no clue how AI is going to be used against me or to influence me, you know, in the next election. So can you give some more examples of maybe how AI is going to even maybe use data on me, my footprint in social media, how that might be used to influence me in the next election?
Sure. So I think that it could happen in a couple ways. So one, the campaigns have there's a lot of consumer data about all of you that's out there, right? The type of car you might drive. If you go to the grocery store and you've got one of those loyalty cards, right? All of that type of stuff goes into commercial databases that campaigns and other marketers can purchase on you. And so we'll see a lot of campaigns. They have been doing a lot of analysis of that to try to, you know, micro-targeting of that type started in 2002, actually. It started with Republicans and then Dems did it as well, where it was like, rather than buying an ad on NBC Evening News broadcast, I'm going to go to the fishing channel because I know that that's going to be where more of my supporters or people are, and I'm going to get it a lot cheaper. So they might now use AI to be able to better help hone in on thinking about where are the places you're spending your time, what are the types of topics that you might be interested in, because different people are interested, right, in different issues. If you're a mom with young kids, you might care a lot more about education than older generations might on Medicare, Social Security, other things. And so they might use AI to try to, and you won't even realize that's happening on the back end, right? And some of that's happening today in terms of the ads and stuff that you get. This might not be for those of you in the room, but in others, we're starting to see AI used to translate content. So there's a candidate or elected official in New York, I want to say, I'm blanking right now. He used AI to make himself speak like a bunch of different languages. He doesn't speak those languages, but now he was able to communicate with his constituents. And there's a huge ethical debate happening right now of, okay, that's fantastic that you can have that conversation, but how do you disclose that he doesn't actually speak that language as you're kind of thinking about that? Those are just two examples off the top of my head of how you might see it happen.
We're depending a lot on professional journalists, and yet that is a career that is getting beleaguered. Can you comment about that issue?
Yeah, I think that, so we're definitely seeing a lot of challenges for professional journalists, right? They are getting laid off from a lot of these organizations. Local news has been somewhat decimated, but I also think we're seeing some shifts. So there are more professional journalists who are, again, starting their own newsletters, starting their own websites as independent journalists and asking people to pay them subscriptions on that. And they have that more traditional journalist background as that is happening. We're starting to see some experiments, I think it's in Maine, where they're trying to experiment with more nonprofit local journalism and to get more people and try to build up some more of those local news organizations. This is another area where AI might also be able to help too, for a local journalist to be able to spend more of their time reporting and going to that local school board meeting or other places, and then being able to just, again, dump in the details and then have AI actually generate the prose, or help them to do the video, edit the video, or make all those different, in what would usually would take maybe 5 or 10 people, maybe you can just do one. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see, well, the other thing I want to say to you, and I didn't bring this up, is how the platforms are handling politics and news. So Meta and TikTok have been straight out being like, we want less politics and news on our platforms. And they're like, it's not worth the headache. It's not worth the challenge. We've just been dragged through the mud. Nobody wants it. People are burnt out. And in fact, a Morning Consult poll about a week or two ago showed Facebook is more popular amongst people now because they're showing less news in politics. So from a business decision, that makes total sense. I'm worried about the long-term ramifications of that, of what that means for people being civically involved. Again, that burnout of news, are they just not going to show up? What is that impact going to be? But then there are others who are, again, Substack's kind of leaning into politics and news. And overall, I keep telling all these platforms, you can run, but you can't hide from politics. People are going to want to talk about it. They're going to want to talk about the news, and that's been a big conversation happening online with the Israeli conflict as well. And Meta has a new platform called Threads that some of you might have heard about. They don't want to call it a Twitter clone, but it's a Twitter clone. And that's where you've seen some of the community of the journalists and others who used to be on Twitter. They're like, we want to be here, and we're doing it anyways, even if you don't, even if you aren't going to amplify it Meta. And so there just continues to be an overall shift, right, in this online ecosystem, and what it looks like and where people are getting that news and what that looks like, that I'm not quite sure how it's all going to shake out. But as somebody who was a journalism major at UW-Madison, like, that was amazing training for me, even though I would not call myself a journalist now, but I try to take a lot of those principles into this. And I wouldn't be surprised if we have more of those conversations in the influencer class of what that looks like and how you try to think about that as some of these professions start to become more professionalized.
In one of your slides, you had on there, there's a lot of layoffs occurring, but you never spoke about it.
For the media or the tech companies, or both?
Tech companies.
Tech companies, yeah. So the layoffs really started this time last year with Elon Musk taking over Twitter. He fired more than half of the folks that were at that platform, which has severely reduced their ability, most of their trust and safety team, which are the teams that build the tools and write the policies to try to find violating content or other ways that people might be trying to try to just create a healthy ecosystem on the platform. Most of those folks were let go. And so there's less people doing that work. Meta then followed in November with their first round of layoffs, and then they did 3 more at the beginning of this year. A lot of that was in HR, in recruiting, because since they were laying people off, they weren't hiring more people that they needed. And then it was sort of across the board in different places where they were letting go. This has been at Meta, Mark's been calling it his year of efficiency, and trying to slim down the organization to be more efficient in what they're trying to do. We've seen some layoffs, not necessarily as many, but at Google, I think LinkedIn had some as well. But the tech companies were bringing in so much money during COVID, and they built up they hired so quickly. And then it kind of did a bit of a 180 for them, and they realized they had built too quickly and they needed to course correct on a lot of that. And so that's where we saw a lot of the thought process too around some of these layoffs as well. Any other questions? If not, I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I hope you enjoyed it.